I never thought a routine plumbing job would change the way I saw love, timing, and connection forever. But that day in Oakmere Heights, when I stepped into a weathered little home with a leaking bathroom sink, I unknowingly stepped into a chapter of my life I'd never forget. I came with nothing but my tools and the intention to fix a few pipes. I left with a question that's still echoing in my mind. What if I'm 45? Would you still stay?
No.
This isn't a story about falling in love the way movies tell it. This is about understanding someone at the exact moment they needed to be seen, and how sometimes staying doesn't mean forever, but it does mean everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was halfway through my morning coffee when the service request came through. Oakmere Heights was a quiet part of town, mostly known for its aging bungalows, broad oak trees, and retirees who fed squirrels like clockwork. The ticket said, leaky bathroom sink, probably loose valves. Please bring tools. Signed by Honora Whitmore. I didn't recognize the name, but the address stood out. That neighborhood was a bit outside my usual range, but I'd had a last-minute cancellation and figured I'd knock it out before noon. When I pulled up to the house, it looked like time had pressed its thumb into the walls. The paint was peeling slightly, the shutters hung crooked, but the yard was clean, flowers trimmed, and the place felt lived in, not neglected, just quiet. I rang the doorbell and waited. It was one of those bells that still gave off that sharp, mechanical ding-dong. No digital nonsense. I heard footsteps after a long pause. The door creaked open. She stood there with a cautious smile, barefoot, wearing loose gray linen pants and a soft black sweater. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a low bun, messy but graceful. She had the kind of face you couldn't place. An age on immediately tired eyes but warm, a quiet beauty that made you feel like you'd interrupted a dream. You must be Roman, she said. I nodded, trying to focus on the task and not the subtle way she tilted her head like she was searching for something in my expression. Come in. The sink's in the upstairs bath. First door on the left. Her voice was calm, low, not timid, just measured. Like every word was carefully chosen. I stepped inside, took off my shoes out of habit, and headed upstairs with my toolbox. The air in the house was soft. That's the only way I can describe it, like the kind of place where nothing rushed. The walls had faded floral wallpaper, the wooden steps creaked in predictable places, and every photo frame I passed held black and white memories. She didn't follow me right away, which gave me a second to adjust to the space. I found the bathroom small, clean, with a little vase of dried lavender beside the mirror. The sink was indeed leaking, just a steady drip from the hot water. Sighed. Easy fix. I set the tools down, got on one knee, started tightening the valves. A few minutes in, I heard her footsteps behind me. She leaned on the doorframe, arms folded loosely across her chest. You work fast, she said, smiling gently. I shrugged, turning the wrench. Just a simple fix, nothing fancy. Nodded, then added almost absently, not everything. That breaks is complicated. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to look underneath. I paused. There was something in her tone that didn't match the casual words. I glanced at her, and for a moment it felt like she wasn't talking about the sink at all. That was the first moment I realized this job might be different. When I finished, I stood up and washed my hands. She handed me a towel without a word, just a soft look in her eyes like she was trying to figure me out. Thank you, she said, more sincere than people usually are after a quick repair. Normally, I'd politely decline. I had another appointment in an hour, but something in the way she asked made me pause. There was no pressure, no awkwardness, just a quiet invitation, like she hadn't said those words to anyone in a long time. I nodded. Sat in her kitchen, mismatched mugs in hand, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. She didn't ask personal questions, didn't press. We spoke lightly about the weather, about how her lavender kept bugs away better than store-bought repellents, about how she used to write poetry but hadn't in years. I learned her name was Nora Whitmore, and that she had lived in that house. For almost 20 years, she never said if she lived alone, but I never heard anyone else. Never saw a second plate, and the way she cleaned up told me she was used to doing it solo. When I finally stood up to leave, she walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Really." I gave her a small nod and promised to check on the repair in a few days, an offer I hadn't planned to make, as I got in my van and pulled away. I kept glancing back in the rearview mirror. She was still standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Not sadly, just present. Like she hadn't watched someone leave in a long time. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the first of many mornings I'd spend in that kitchen. Sipping tea, wondering how a simple repair job became something far less fixable and far more human. 2 days later, I found myself rerouting my schedule just to pass by her house. I told myself it was to check on the valve seal, to make sure there weren't any secondary leaks or buildup I'd missed, but deep down I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I'd done dozens of repairs that month alone, and never once felt the urge to revisit one, unless it was a paid follow-up. But something about that house, about Nora, lingered. The kind of presence you didn't just shake off with the hum of your van's engine or the distraction of another job. I stopped in front of her gate that morning, unsure whether to knock or just keep driving. I didn't have anything official lined up with her. No scheduled appointment, no invoice pending. Just a quiet kitchen memory, the scent of lavender, and a woman who seemed like she'd folded 1,000 emotions into a single cup of tea. Before I could second-guess myself, the front door opened. She stepped out, wearing a thick cream cardigan draped over her shoulders and holding a small metal watering can. Her eyes flicked toward me with an expression that looked half surprised and half expecting. She didn't smile right away. Just raised the can slightly in greeting and nodded toward the front gate like she was letting me in without a word. I parked, grabbed my tool bag, though I didn't really need it, and walked up the path toward her. She didn't rush to meet me, just continued watering a small patch of marigolds near the porch. When I reached the steps, she finally looked up, her face softened by morning light and the scent of soil. "Back already?" she asked. Her voice carried no judgment, only curiosity, like she had been flipping a coin in her head, wondering whether I'd actually return. I told her I wanted to double-check the seal and make sure everything was holding. She tilted her head, skeptical, but not unkind. "Most plumbers don't do wellness checks," she said, and I laughed, admitting I didn't usually. She invited me in again, this time without the formalities. No towel exchange, no pointed directions, just a glance at the stairs and a quiet, the way. The sink was perfectly fine. There's no signs of leakage, no rattling pipes. It was, in every technical sense, a clean job. But I still pretended to make adjustments, fiddling with the pet trap and rechecking the silicone bonding like I was teaching a masterclass in over-preparedness. From the hallway, I could hear her humming faintly a low, nostalgic melody I couldn't place. She wasn't performing for me. That was clear. It was the kind of hum people let out when they forget they're not alone. I tightened one last bolt and stood, dusting off my hands more from habit than necessity. She met me at the bottom of the stairs this time, offering a plate with 2 shortbread cookies and that same mug from before, filled with a new kind of tea I didn't recognize. "This one's rose hips and chamomile," she said. For clarity and calm, I thanked her, and we settled again at the kitchen table. As if we were slipping back into a paused scene from 2 days earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. IT means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Conversation flowed more easily now. She asked where I grew up, and I told her about my small-town childhood bike rides through gravel roads. The old gas station where everyone stopped for root beer. Floats, the way I used to take apart radios just to see if I could put them back together. She laughed when I told her about a 4th-grade science project that exploded in my dad's garage, and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners made her look 10 years younger. I asked if she'd always lived in Oakmere Heights, and her smile dimmed just a touch. "Not always," she said. but long enough to call it home, long enough to forget where I was before. There was a pause in the air after that. Not heavy. Not sad, just a quiet recognition that some memories are better left folded behind the newer ones. A soft chime echoed from the living room clock. She glanced at it and stood up, apologizing that she had a video call with an old college friend. I gathered my things slowly, not wanting to seem like I was lingering, even though I clearly was. She walked me to the door again, but this time she stood a little closer. As I turned to go, she reached out lightly, fingers brushing my sleeve. "Roman," she said, her tone different now, gentler, almost like a whisper, but then she paused. "Nothing, just thank you again." I nodded, not pressing her to finish. Some sentences don't need endings. Over the next week, I saw her twice more. It's the first time I dropped off some spare washers and an O-ring she might need in the future, and excuse, really, but a valid one. The second, she invited me over under the pretense of needing help realigning a squeaky cabinet door. Each time we ended up at that same kitchen table, talking about everything and nothing. She told me she used to write poems but never shared them. I admitted I once wanted to be a carpenter, but fell into plumbing because it paid the bills. She showed me a small book of pressed flowers she'd kept since 1993. I told her about my brother's wedding next month and how I wasn't sure whether I'd bring a date. She smiled at that, and I noticed she never asked why. Then came the fourth visit. This time I brought a small bouquet lavender and baby's breath because I'd seen them in a shop window and thought of her. I didn't say that part, of course. Just handed them over and watched as she held the stems like they were too fragile to touch. She placed them in a narrow glass vase by the window, then poured us both a cup of that same rosehip and chamomile blend. We didn't talk much that day, just sat together, watching the trees sway and letting the silence say what our words couldn't. I wasn't sure what we were building, if anything. We weren't dating. We weren't friends in the way friends usually are. But there was a rhythm, forming a quiet trust that felt more real than anything I'd known in a long while. And still, she kept a part of herself locked away, just out of reach. I never saw family photos, never heard a phone ring, never caught the scent of someone else's cologne in the hallway. It was like she'd built a world made just for one, and I was the first guest she'd invited in without an expiration date. I didn't know what she needed from me, but I knew I wasn't ready to leave yet. By the time I pulled into Nora's driveway for the 5th time, I no longer needed an excuse to visit. The toolbox still came with me, but we both knew I wouldn't be using it. Our house had grown familiar. In the way only quiet spaces can, each creaking step on the porch, each chipped tile in the entryway, each wind chime note that echoed when the door opened. I'd always prided myself on being a man who kept things simple. Fix what's broken, leave when the job's done, no strings. But simplicity had started to unravel the moment Nora looked at me not as a plumber, but as someone worth talking. 2. I'd been to houses before where the client offered a cup of coffee or made small talk to be polite. But with Nora, it never felt like hospitality. It felt like intention. Like she'd been waiting for the kind of silence that let her say things she'd been holding in for years. That afternoon was warmer than usual. The late spring heat wrapped around the house like a blanket, and the smell of rosemary and cut grass filled the air as I stepped out of the van. Nora was in the backyard this time, tending to the raised garden bed that sat crookedly in the corner of her yard. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, and her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. She looked up when I came through the gate, not startled, just amused. She said something about the squash getting too bold, and how it was starting to climb over her time like it owned the place. I laughed, offering to help, and soon I was elbow-deep in soil, pulling weeds while she snipped herbs and placed them into a tin bowl. It didn't feel like work, though. It felt like companionship in its simplest form. Shared space, shared effort, no expectations. After we finished in the garden, she brought out 2 tall glasses of lemonade, the kind with pulp, and floating slices of lemon that told you it was fresh. We sat under the shade of an old oak tree, not saying much, just listening to the wind. She reached down to pull a leaf from her sandal and winced slightly. That's when I noticed the long, faint scar on the side of her ankle. It wasn't fresh, and I didn't ask about it. She caught me glancing and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like she understood the question I didn't ask. "It was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Some things leave marks even when they're healed." I didn't know if she meant the scar or something deeper. Either way, I nodded back. We didn't talk about it again. Later that afternoon, she invited me in to wash up. I followed her to the kitchen sink and watched as she carefully unwrapped the herbs and rinsed them under cool water. The radio played softly in the background, an old jazz tune with a trumpet that danced between the notes like a conversation. Nora hummed along, out of tune but effortlessly charming. I leaned against the counter, drying my hands with a towel, when she suddenly turned to me with a peculiar look in her eyes, not sad, not happy, just searching. She asked if I had ever been married. I shook my head, smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't," she said. "Not unless you're ready to let go of who you think you are." It was the kind of statement that came from experience, not bitterness. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. But the weight of her words settled between us like a folded blankets, heavy and warm. I asked her if she'd been, and she said yes. Once, briefly. It ended not with betrayal or anger, but with the kind of silence that grows so loud you can't ignore it anymore. She told me he left one morning and didn't come back, and that she didn't chase him because she'd already felt him slipping away for months. Sometimes, she said, people leave long before the door actually shuts. That evening, stretched longer than the others, we lingered in the living room, sipping more tea, the scent of fresh herbs still clinging to our fingers. I noticed that she always sat with one leg tucked under her and kept a blanket nearby, even in the warmth. Comfort, she told me, was her favorite form of rebellion. "People think solitude is sad," she mused, "but there's power in choosing your own company." I told her I understood, even though I wasn't sure if I fully did. When I finally stood to leave, it was already dark outside. Street lamps cast long shadows across the lawn, and the hum of distant crickets filled the space between our words. She walked me to the door like she always did, but this time she hesitated as I reached for the handle. "Roman," she said softly, "do you ever feel like time is folding in on itself?" Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the vulnerability of asking something she rarely voiced. I told her I felt that way more often than I'd like to admit. She smiled, then really smiled and whispered, "Then maybe we're both just trying to fix what isn't actually broken." I left feeling full and hollow all at once, like I'd just been given a piece of someone's soul and didn't know where to put it. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way her fingers brushed the rim of her cup when she was deep in thought, about the way she watched the sky as if waiting for it to tell her something. I found myself wondering what she was doing at different hours of the day. Was she reading on the porch? Listening to music with her eyes closed? Writing poems she'd never show anyone? I told myself I wasn't falling for her. It was just curiosity, just admiration. But those were the kinds of lies you tell yourself when the truth feels too soon. I started rearranging my work schedule again, deliberately leaving my afternoons open. I took longer lunch breaks, claimed errands that didn't exist, and every time I found myself driving down her street, I convinced myself it was chance. But it wasn't. I was looking for something, or maybe just someone who had already seen through the walls I didn't know I'd built around myself. And every time she opened the door, I found myself breathing a little easier. Like the world made more sense inside that lavender-scented house than it did anywhere else. It had been almost 3 weeks since I first stepped into Nora's home with a wrench and a quiet obligation. Since then, what started as a leaky sink had transformed into something far less tangible, but far more real. I couldn't define what we weren't at friends in the traditional sense. It's not lovers, not family, but every time I crossed her threshold, something about me softened. I wasn't a man prone to reflection. Most of my life was a steady march from one task to the next. Plumbing didn't require emotional nuance, it demanded skill, consistency, and a certain level of patience. But Nora had a way of pulling emotion out of me without ever asking for it directly. It wasn't in what she said, but in the space she created. That space was where I began to question things I hadn't considered in years. And I think deep down, she knew that. One overcast morning, I found myself outside her home without even planning it. My truck slowed instinctively as I passed her street, and by the time I realized what I was doing, I was already pulling into the gravel drive. The sky was a dull gray, thick with the promise of rain. I didn't have tools with me this time. No box, no parts, not even an excuse. I had just come from a supply run and still had receipts stuffed in my jacket pocket. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to decide if I should just drive away before she saw me. But then the front door opened. She was wearing a navy cardigan over a faded yellow shirt and holding a paperback book in one hand. A knitted blanket draped over her other arm. She raised her eyebrows when she saw me, the corner of her mouth twitching in quiet amusement. I got out of the truck, not even pretending to look busy. She waved me in with a flick of her wrist and turned back into the house, like she'd expected. Me all along. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and baked apples greeted me. Something was in the oven. I stood near the entryway while she folded the blanket over the back of her couch, then placed the book's spine up on the armrest. She moved like she always died slow, intentional, never wasting motion. I admired that. About her. In a world that always demanded speed, she refused to rush anything. "I was just thinking about you," she said without turning around. "Oh," I replied, "you're not the only one." The words came out before I realized how honest they were. She glanced back at me with a softness that made me feel 16 again, vulnerable, clumsy in my emotions. We ended up on the couch with mugs of chai tea and thick slices of warm apple bread. It was the first time she let me sit next to her instead of a cross. Our shoulders didn't touch, but the gap between us felt intentional, like we were both aware of it, but not ready to close it. She told me about the book she was reading. Something about a woman who takes a train across the country to scatter her sister's ashes and ends up finding pieces of herself in the silence of the journey. I asked if she read often. "Too," she said, "but then I got tired of other people's endings." I asked her what she meant. She shrugged and said, "Books always end too soon or too neatly. Life doesn't do that. Life doesn't tie things up in bows." I wanted to argue with her, to say that some endings were good, that some resolutions were earned. But instead, I just nodded. Because in that moment, I agreed. We talked for hours, about music, about silence, about the first time she realized she wasn't the person she had set out to be, and how maybe that was okay. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had spent a long time learning how to be alone without being lonely. That distinction, she said, was everything. She told me she had one sibling, a sister, but they hadn't spoken in years. Too many words said in the wrong order was how she explained it. She didn't offer more, and I didn't push. I knew that feeling well. I had an older brother I hadn't spoken to since our mother's funeral, and even that day had ended in a parking lot argument over nothing and everything at once. Later, the rain finally came. It started softly, just a whisper on the windows, then grew louder until it became a full-blown downpour. She lit 2 candles in the kitchen and turned off the overhead lights. The house felt smaller in the glow, warmer. We stood by the window, watching the drops race each other down the glass. She made a joke about her gutters probably overflowing again, and how I'd have to fix them too. I told her I'd do it gladly, and I meant it. She looked up at me then, eyes serious, searching. There was a pause, one of those long silences that hums with meaning. Then she asked, almost hesitantly, "Roman, do you ever think about time?" I blinked. In what way? She tilted her head, the candlelight catching the side of her face. About how it moves differently when you're with certain people. Slower, fuller, like it wants to stretch out and stay. It took me a few seconds to find words. "Yeah," I said. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. The silence between us shifted. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was full, like a room crowded with unspoken things. I reached out slowly and touched her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She just looked at her hands, her thumb tracing mine like she was memorizing the shape. Then she asked the question that would stay with me for days. Quiet, unassuming, yet loud in its implications. "Roman," she said, "what if I'm 45? Would you still stay?" The words caught me off guard, not because of the age, but because of what was folded inside them. It wasn't about numbers. It was about doubt. Doubt about whether someone like her, weathered by life, cautious with her heart, not young, but not old, was still worthy of being chosen. I stared at her, unable to speak for a moment. Her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't joking. She wasn't fishing for compliments. She was asking if I saw her, all of her, and if I'd still choose to remain. And in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't thought about her age once, not when she handed me tea, not when she spoke about poetry, or pressed flowers, or burned bread, not when she watched the wind or held her knees close to her chest on the porch swing. I had seen her not as a woman of any particular age, but as a person whose soul made the world quieter, calmer, better. I didn't answer her right away. I let the question hang in the space between us. It's not because I didn't know my answer, because I wanted her to feel the truth of it in the silence before I ever said it aloud. I didn't answer her question with words, not right then. Instead, I looked at Hathaway. Her hand trembled slightly beneath mine, the faint furrow in her brow as if bracing for a response she already feared in. I gave her the only truth I could offer in that moment. I stayed. I didn't rush to leave when the rain eased or when the clock in the other room struck 6. I didn't pretend I had another job to finish or errands to run. I just stayed. We stood in that kitchen until the candlelight grew smaller, and the world outside faded into a damp hush. And eventually I saw something shift in her eyes. Not relief exactly, more like a quiet, cautious hope. She didn't ask the question again, and I didn't volunteer an answer. But from that point forward, something between us had undeniably changed. The next time I saw her, it wasn't by accident or under the pretense of a repair. She had called me, not with a request or a problem, just with a simple invitation. She was baking again and asked if I wanted to come by for a taste test. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived, and her kitchen smelled like vanilla, citrus zest, and something unfamiliar but comforting. She'd made olive oil Caycan old, recipe she found tucked inside a dusty book from her mother's collection. She handed me a slice on a mismatched floral plate and leaned against the counter, watching me take the first bite like a child waiting to see if their creation passed inspection. It was good, more than good. But I told her it was too sweet, just to see her protest. She did, half laughing, half defending herself, arms folded and her eyes narrowed like she was ready to start a culinary debate. But beneath her playful scolding, there was something else in ease that hadn't been there before. We ended up eating the entire cake between us, sitting on the floor in her living room while the sky outside shifted through shades of gold and plum. Nora pulled out an old box of photographs and letters, unprompted. She said she hadn't opened it in years, and for some reason, today felt like the right day. Inside were black and white snapshots of her as a girl on a swing set, sun-drenched. Polaroids of road trips from decades past, letters in fading ink from people I didn't recognize. She'll let me hold each one. Let me read a few. Not everything's. Some notes she tucked away quickly, glancing at me with a brief shake of her head. Not those. I respected that. We all have parts of our past that don't need company. Among the photos was one that stood out to me not because of the quality or the subject, but because of the look in Nora's eyes. She was maybe in her 20s, sitting on the hood of a faded red car, her legs crossed and a book in her lap. But it wasn't the youthfulness or the scenery that caught me. It was the expression, calm, steady, a woman who looked like she already knew who she was, even if life would later reshape her. I handed it back to her carefully, and she smiled, touching the edge of the picture like it might crumble. "Oh, that was a good summer," she said softly, before everything got complicated. We didn't speak much after that. The silence returned. But this time it was companionable, not heavy. As night settled in, she reached for a blanket and tossed one corner to me. We sat side by side on the rug, not touching, but close enough that our shoulders occasionally bumped. The glow of the lamp made everything in the room seem warmer, softer, like the edges of our lives were slowly blending together. At one point, she leaned her head back against the couch and whispered, more to the ceiling than to me, I think I forgot what it felt like to be seen. I didn't know how to respond to that, not in the moment. So I just sat there with her, letting her know through my presence that she wasn't invisible anymore. In the days that followed, we developed a rhythm. I'd stop by once or twice a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just with stories from my day. She'd offer me tea or something she'd baked, and we'd fall into long conversations that drifted effortlessly between light and serious. There was never any pressure, never any agenda, just the slow, careful unfolding of two people who had spent most of their adult lives guarding their hearts. We learned each other's habits, each other's quiet moods. She started calling me her shadow whenever I showed up unannounced. I started leaving small notes around her house, on the fridge, under a coaster, inside her recipe books. Little things, jokes, quotes, questions I didn't want to ask aloud. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Friday, and I had worked late at a commercial site across town. I was tired, dirty, and not planning on stopping by. But something pulled me there anyway. When I arrived, the porch light was off. The house looked still. I knocked, unsure if she was even home. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Nora stood there in pajamas, no makeup, her hair pulled back with a headband. Her eyes were red. She didn't say anything at first. Just stepped aside to let me in. I followed her to the kitchen where a half-empty wine glass sat on the counter. She poured another for herself, then for me, and finally spoke. "My ex-husband called tonight," she said, her voice flat. "First time in over a decade." I said nothing, just waited. She told me he wanted to meet, said he was passing through town and wanted to catch up, see how she was doing. She said she didn't answer, didn't know if she would, but it had shaken her. Not because she missed him, because it reminded her of who she had once been. It's the girl who had waited by the window. Of the woman who had once tried to make someone stay, who was already halfway gone. She stared into her glass like it held answers, then set it down and looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Roman," she said slowly, "you don't have to keep showing up here. You're not obligated. This isn't a project for you to fix." I felt the words hit me, not because I disagreed, but because I understood. I took a breath and stepped closer, not touching her, just standing. In her space. "I'm not here because you need fixing," I said. "I'm here because I want to be." She searched my face for signs of hesitation, of uncertainty, and when she found none, something in her unraveled. She closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she reached out, fingers lightly grazing my wrist. And for the first time, we didn't pretend there was a reason for me to leave. The days after that night felt different. Not because anything was explicitly said or labeled, but because something invisible had shifted. We both knew it. It hung in the air, quiet and steady like the hum of an old appliance you don't notice until it stops. I still knocked when I arrived, still brought little things, fresh bread from a corner bakery. A box of loose tea leaves I thought she'd like. Once even a rusty old lamp I'd fixed up from a flea market. She still rolled her eyes when I insisted on helping her with the dishes, still made her sarcastic remarks about my savior complex. But now when I left, her fingers lingered a little longer at the door. And when we sat on the couch, she didn't sit on the opposite end anymore. She curled up beside me, knees drawn close, her head occasionally resting against my shoulder, as if it had always belonged there. I began noticing the smallest things about her. How she always smelled faintly like lavender and lemon. How she hummed when she was anxious, often some tune I couldn't recognize. How her eyes scanned a room not for decoration but for stories, what the wear in a chair's cushion. Revealed what the dust patterns meant on a shelf. What absence looked like when someone left a space too fast. I knew I was falling for her, but it didn't feel like falling. It felt like walking through a familiar home and discovering a new room each time I turned a corner. I didn't feel out of control. I felt grounded, present. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived at her place with no plan. No job, no excuse. Just the need to see her. The sky had been playing tricks all day, bright one minute, overcast the next, as if unsure of its own mood. When she opened the door, She didn't speak. She just pulled me inside, took my hand, and led me to the back patio. There was a blanket already spread across the wooden deck, a small thermos of tea beside it, and a book left open to a page fluttering in the wind. "I thought you'd come," she said simply, and I believed her. We sat in the muted light, sipping our tea as the sky finally gave in and let the rain fall gently around us, the overhang keeping us dry. She read aloud from her book something about a woman discovering herself later in life, and her voice seemed to slow time itself. Then, as the sun peeked briefly through the gray, she asked if I wanted to see something. She stood and guided me down the back path behind her garden, through a crooked wooden gate that led to a shed I had assumed was long abandoned. Inside was a studio of sorts. Old canvases lined the walls, some painted, some bare. A battered easel stood in the center, and a faint smell of turpentine lingered in the air. There were brushes, palettes, and jars of colors that had long since dried up. I turned to her in surprise. "You paint?" She looked embarrassed for the first time since I'd met her. "I used to," she said, years ago. Then life happened. I asked her why she stopped. She shrugged. "Because no one was looking."
Ass.
That sentence sat with me. It echoed in my head long after she closed the shed door. I wanted to tell her that I was looking now, that I saw her in all her dimensions, the brave parts, the cautious ones, the shadows she didn't think showed. But I didn't say any of it. I just walked beside her, our arms brushing now and then, and let her silence be enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. IT means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That weekend, we cooked dinner together. Well, mostly she cooked, and I got in the way under the pretense of helping. She teased me for chopping vegetables too slowly, for forgetting to wash the basil, for asking where she kept the colander after I'd used it twice before. But I could tell she enjoyed the company, as the radio played an old Motown track, and she spun in place while stirring the sauce. Smiling in that easy, unforced way I was starting to crave, at one point, she reached for a spoonful of the tomato mixture and offered it to me. I leaned forward, tasted it, and when I looked up, she was closer than I expected. Her hand lingered at my jaw for a beat too long. Our eyes met. And then the moment passed. She pulled away, cleared her throat, and went back to the stove. But something in my chest stayed humming. After dinner, we sat outside again. The stars were out that night, the sky unusually clear for spring. She brought out 2 glasses of red. Winan told me about her father, how he used to lie on the roof with her when she was little, pointing out constellations and making up stories for the ones he didn't know. He believed the stars remembered us, she said, like little lights marking where we've been. I asked her if she believed that too. She paused, then nodded. "Maybe I think the people we lose leave echoes in everything. Sounds, smells, shapes. And if we pay attention, we can feel them watching sometimes, not with sadness, but with permission." I thought of my grandfather then. He had raised me for a time after my parents split, taught me how to fix things, how to keep my word, how to listen better than I spoke. He used to say, "If something's broken, don't throw it away. Yet, it might still have a purpose." At the time, he was talking about old furniture and busted pipes, but maybe he was talking about people too. It was late when I finally stood to leave. Nora walked me to the door as usual, but this time, she reached for my hand before I could turn the knob. "Roman," she said quietly, "I know you didn't answer me that night when I asked if you'd stay. I don't want to force you into saying something just because it's what I want to hear. But I want you to know, I've spent most of my adult life trying to be fine on my own. I've gotten good at it. But lately, I've started wondering if being fine is the same as being happy." I turned to face her fully, my hands still in hers. Her eyes searched mine again, not with desperation, but with courage. I didn't hesitate this time. I raised her hand to my lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Then I said the words I'd been holding on to for too long. "I'm not going anywhere, Nora. Age, scars, quiet days, and all. I'm here because I want to be, and I'd still be here if you were 45 or 75. Because you're the first place that's ever felt like home. Her breath caught, and her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned in, rested her forehead against mine, and whispered, "Then let's stop pretending we're just passing time." That night was the first time I stayed, not as a guest who fell asleep on the couch, not as a worker who came early and left when the job was done. I stayed because it felt natural. The way some songs don't end, they just fade out slowly. We didn't rush into anything. We didn't even share a bed. Nora set up extra pillows on the couch, and I stretched. Out in the flickering glow of her fireplace, the room quiet, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop of settling wood. But despite the physical distance, I could feel her presence in every corner of the room, her scent in the throw blanket, her rhythm in the stillness, her trust in the silence that filled the space between us. In the morning, I woke up before. The sun, the world outside was still blue and muted, the kind of early dawn that feels like the earth is holding its breath. I wandered into the kitchen barefoot, careful not to make a sound, and began heating water for coffee. I found a note on the counter in her handwriting. "If I'm not up, let the cat out, he thinks he owns the yard." I chuckled quietly and peeked around for the cat, a plump ginger tabby who looked at me like I was trespassing, even though I had fed him before. I opened the back door and watched him pad out into the dewless grass like a little king, inspecting his morning kingdom. Nora emerged not long after, wrapped in a robe, her hair still tangled from sleep, eyes squinting. In the soft light, she didn't speak right away. Just watched me as I handed her a steaming mug and nodded toward the porch. We sat there together, side by side, shoulders brushing occasionally, watching the world wake up. She tucked her feet beneath her and leaned slightly toward me. "I haven't woken up with someone in years," she said softly. "It feels strange, but not bad." I reached over, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and said, "Then let's not rush it. Let it be strange. Let it be whatever it needs to be." In the days that followed, our dynamic subtly shifted. I wasn't just dropping by anymore. I was part of her routine, and she was becoming part of mine. I started storing a spare change of clothes in the hallway closet. She rearranged a drawer in her kitchen so I could leave a few tools behind. We still didn't name it. We didn't use words like relationship or together because it didn't feel like something that needed naming. It just was. And in that simplicity, we found something profound. But simplicity doesn't mean the absence of complexity. One afternoon, we were sitting at the dining table, sorting through some old paperwork. She wanted help organizing bills, receipts, outdated insurance forms. I came across a thin envelope addressed to her in elegant cursive. She tensed when I picked it up. "You can skip that one," she said, a little too quickly. I paused. "It's from my mother," she added, her voice flat. "We haven't spoken in over a decade. She writes once a year. Same day. I never open them." I gently placed the envelope back on the stack without asking further questions. But the air in the room changed. Something heavy settled between us. That evening, Nora was quieter than usual. She made dinner grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, but barely touched her food. When I tried to lighten the mood with a story from a particularly stubborn client I'd worked with earlier that day, she forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Eventually, she stood, walked to the sink, and began scrubbing dishes with more intensity than necessary. I joined her, taking the towel and drying in silence. When the last plate was stacked away, she turned to me. "Roman, do you ever feel like some parts of your life are locked behind a door you don't have the key to anymore?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Yeah, but I've learned that sometimes we carry that key without even knowing it. We just have to stop being afraid to try the lock." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That night, she didn't sit as close. She curled up on the far side of the couch with her knees to her chest and stared at the television. Without really watching, I didn't push. I just sat beside her, letting the quiet stretch out. Eventually, her hand crept across the cushion, fingers brushing mine. I wrapped my hand around hers and held on, neither of us speaking. The next day, she called me while I was on a job. Her voice was shaky. I read the letter, she said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't angry, just sad. She said she misses me, that she's sorry, that she didn't know how to love me properly, but she always tried. I stopped what I was doing and sat on the edge of a concrete step, letting her words sink. Do you want to see her? I asked gently. She hesitated. Maybe. I don't know. But I wanted you to know that I read it. And that's something. It was something. A big something. And I realized in that moment just how deeply I was becoming woven into her healing process. It's not as a crutch, not as someone to fix the broken parts, but as someone she could turn to when she chose to face them. That kind of trust is heavier than love. It's more sacred. We took a drive the following weekend. She needed space, and I needed to be wherever she was. We headed out toward the coast, where the air turned salty and the wind carried stories from the sea. We didn't plan anything, no itinerary, no reservations, just her hand on the gear shift and mine occasionally covering it. Miles passing beneath our tires like chapters flipping forward, we found a small roadside diner, ordered greasy sandwiches and black coffee, and sat at a booth near the window. She stared out at the ocean and said, I used to come here when I was younger. I imagined I'd grow up and write a novel, live in a beach cottage, grow tomatoes, and never wear shoes again. I smiled. You still can, you know? She laughed, not bitterly, but with the amused acceptance of someone who knows the world rarely bends to youthful dreams. Maybe I just needed to meet the right handyman first. Later, we walked along the shore, our shoes in hand, the wet sand cool beneath our feet. She reached down to pick up a piece of sea glass and held it up to the light. Broken, she said, but still beautiful. I watched her closely, the way her face softened, the wind lifting her hair, the sadness in her eyes mingling with resilience. I realized then that I loved her, fully, without needing her to be different or healed or whole. I loved her exactly as she was, in the mess, in the grace, in the quiet questions she didn't always ask aloud. That night, back in her home, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering between us. Roman, she said, I want to stop waiting for everything. For the right time, the right words, the right version of myself. I want to stop holding my breath. I reached across the table, took her hand, and said, Then let's breathe together. From now on, the days that followed became quieter, but not in an empty way. More like the hush of a home that no longer needed to shout to be heard. Nora and I settled into a rhythm that neither of us spoke aloud, but both of us felt deeply. Mornings began with shared silence over coffee. Afternoons passed in the subtle exchange of glances and unspoken understanding, and evenings curled around us like the edge of a favorite blanket, soft, familiar, and always welcome. There was no grand declaration of what we were, no moment where we paused to define ourselves. We were simply living side by side, and for two people who had spent so long doing life alone, that simple act was revolutionary. She started painting again, slowly at first. I came in one afternoon to find her studio door cracked open, the scent of oil paints faint in the hallway. Inside, she stood in front of the easel, brush in hand, staring at a blank canvas like it might bite her if she moved too quickly. She didn't notice me at first, so I watched her quietly. She took a breath, dipped the brush in blue, and made a stroke delicate, uncertain, but real. She caught my reflection in the window and smiled without turning.
Out.
She whispered, Not yet. I nodded and left her to it, heart swelling with a quiet pride. The next day, the canvas held the beginnings of a sky-wide Moody, a little wild, just like her. One evening, after a slow dinner of roasted vegetables and rice pilaf, we were sitting on her couch with her legs draped across my lap. The television played an old film neither of us were really watching. Her hand traced slow circles on my wrist as she spoke softly, almost like she didn't want the words to exist outside the moment. When I was married, she began, I used to imagine what it would be like to disappear. Not in a dramatic way, just fade. Stop having to perform. Stop managing expectations. I didn't want to be someone's trophy or disappointment. I just wanted to be me. I didn't interrupt. I just kept tracing lines along her shin, grounding her in the present. She continued, "There were mornings I'd lie in bed and pretend I was someone else, a woman without history, a woman who hadn't made so many mistakes. I finally spoke gently. But you're not your mistakes, Nora. You're what you've survived. You're what you've built after. That matters more." She didn't respond, but her fingers gripped mine a little tighter. Later that night, she took out the letter from her mother again. This time, she handed it to me. "Will you read it out loud?" she asked. I hesitated, then unfolded the paper. The words were simple, laced with regret and the awkward vulnerability of someone trying to bridge a chasm they helped create. Spoke of missed birthdays, misunderstood fights, and the painful silence that had grown like ivy over the years. When I finished, Nora was crying not the kind of sobs that erupt and shatter, but quiet, steady tears that rolled down her cheeks, unchecked. I didn't try to stop them. I just pulled her close and let her cry against my shoulder until the weight of it lessened. We began to talk more about the past after that night, not always directly and not always comfortably, but it came in bits like puzzle pieces. She was finally willing to lay out on the table. She told me about a miscarriage she had at 32, about the way her then-husband had treated her grief like an inconvenience. She told me how she had buried that pain so deep it almost didn't feel like hers anymore. I told her about my father's absence, how I used to pretend he was a secret agent rather than a man who simply didn't want to be a dad. We didn't try to fix each other, we just listened. And in that listening, healing began not as a dramatic epiphany, but like rain softening hard soil. Around this time, Nora began repainting her bedroom. It wasn't planned. One morning she woke up, looked around and said, "I need this room to feel like mine again." I helped her move furniture and cover the floors. She picked a pale sage, green subtle but calming. We painted for hours, the scent of fresh paint filling the air, our clothes dotted with splashes of color. At one point she stepped off the ladder, turned to me with paint on her cheek and said, "Do you ever get the feeling we're creating something we'll miss before it's even gone?" I thought about that for a long moment. "Maybe," I said, "but maybe it's worth creating anyway, even if it's fleeting. That's how we make meaning." That night, as we lay in bed together for the first time, the intimacy wasn't just physical, it was emotional, rooted in trust and time and a mutual willingness to show our scars. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Her body curled into mine like it had always known the shape of me. I ran my fingers through her hair, kissed the crease of her shoulder, and thought, maybe this is what it means to love someone fully, not because they're perfect, but because they've been honest about the ways they're not. A week later, something unexpected happened. My sister called. She was getting married, and she wanted me to come. We hadn't spoken much in years. I told Nora about it, and she asked if I would go. I said I wasn't sure. "Maybe you should," she said gently. Closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from choosing to show up, even if it's uncomfortable. Her words stayed with me, so I went. Nora packed me snacks for the road and handed me a small note before I left. "In case you need reminding," it said, "you are more than where you came from." I attended the wedding, reconnected with my sister, and came back feeling lighter, like a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying had finally shifted. When I returned, Nora greeted me at the door with a hug that said she'd missed me every hour I was gone. That night, we lay together under a sky full of stars, and I whispered, "Thank you for helping me find my way back to myself." She kissed my forehead and said, "You did that on your own. I just made space." It wasn't a dramatic moment. That made me realize I was in this for the long haul. There was no sudden declaration or grand gesture. It was in the small things, the way she handed me a mug with both hands like it was something precious. The way she remembered how I liked my eggs, even though I always claimed I didn't care. The way she stopped to pull weeds from the garden. Because as she put it, you don't get to choose where beauty grows, but you do get to protect it. These small acts, quiet and unspoken, told me more about her than any long conversation ever could. And they told me more about myself too. I wasn't drifting anymore. I wasn't just fixing sinks and fences and leaving when the work was done. I had found something here. Something I didn't want to leave behind. We had started renovating the hallway bathroom, more out of boredom than necessity. Nora said she wanted the space to feel less like a memory and more like a choice. I didn't press her on what she meant, but I suspected it had something to do with her past, maybe with the man she used to be married to, maybe with the woman she used to be when she lived in this house with someone else. As we stripped old wallpaper and scraped away years of paint, she told me stories about how she used to take long baths with a glass of red wine and a book she never finished. I used to think I was romantic, she said, but maybe I was, just lonely and didn't know how to name it. That afternoon, while painting the trim, she suddenly asked, "Do you think people get second chances? I mean real ones. Not just new relationships, but new ways of being?" I paused, brushed midair. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "But I don't think they come wrapped in fireworks. I think they come in mornings where you wake up and decide to be a little kinder, a little braver. I think second chances look a lot like ordinary days that you choose not to waste." She didn't respond, but later that night she placed her old wedding ring in a small wooden box and slid it into the back of a drawer. She didn't say anything about it, but I noticed we were out for a walk the next week, wandering through a local farmer's market, when we bumped into someone from her past. An old friend, maybe more, I couldn't quite tell. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who knew exactly how to smile and shake hands and say all the right things. Nora stiffened beside me. The exchange pleasantry, tight-lipped, overly polite. After he walked away, she let out a breath she'd been holding. He once told me I was too intense, that I felt things too deeply, like it was a flaw. I looked at her, really looked, and said, "Your depth is what makes you extraordinary, Nora. Anyone who couldn't handle that was drowning in shallow water." She squeezed my hand, and we kept walking. That night, we sat on her porch, watching the sun melt into the trees. She rested her head on my shoulder and said, "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just going to fix the sink and leave. I didn't think you'd stay. I didn't think anyone would." I turned to her, brushing my thumb across the back of her hand. "I didn't think I'd stay either," I admitted. "But something about you made me want to slow down. Made me want to build something, not just repair what's broken." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she whispered, "I think I'm scared." I nodded. "Me too. But maybe that's how we know it's real." As the days turned to weeks, we began to blend our lives in subtle, deliberate ways. I moved a few tools into her garage. She started keeping my favorite snacks in her pantry. My mail started arriving at her address, and we stopped pretending it was temporary. There were moments of friction. Of course, no two people merged lives without it. We argued once about something trivial, the kind of disagreement that isn't really about what's being said. It ended with both of us sitting at opposite ends of the couch, arms crossed, silence heavy between us. Eventually, she got up, walked to the kitchen, and returned with 2 glasses of water. She handed me one and said, "I don't want to be right. I want us to be okay." That moment taught me more about love than any poem or movie ever could. We started talking about the future in cautious, abstract ways. It's not marriage or moving or grand plans, but simple questions. Would you ever want to visit Italy? Do you think you'd like a dog? What kind of house would you build if money wasn't a factor? These weren't plans, not yet, but they were seeds, and we were both willing to water them. One evening, as we sat flipping through an old photo album she had pulled from the attic, I saw a picture of her at 30 standing in front of a bookstore with a copy of a novel in her hand. She looked radiant, confident, full of dreams. "That was the first time I thought I could write," she said. "I wrote 2 chapters and then convinced myself no one would care." I closed the album and looked at her. "Maybe you should start again." She laughed. "At my age," I took her hand. "Your age is exactly the reason you should. You've lived enough to say something worth reading." That night, she pulled out an old notebook and began scribbling. I didn't ask what she was writing. I just stayed beside her, watching her brow furrow in concentration, her fingers moving across the page like they had waited years for this. Later, she read a paragraph aloud. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that made it beautiful. There was one more conversation we hadn't had yet. It's the kind that hovers quietly, waiting to be invited in. One morning, over coffee, she finally asked, "Roman, do you ever think about leaving?" I looked at her, surprised. "Leaving?" She shrugged. "I mean, I know this was never part of your plan. I'm not easy. I come with a past and a complicated family and a garden that needs weeding every other week." I reached across the table, took her face in my hands, and said, "I didn't come here looking for a plan. I came here because something about this house, this life, this woman made me want to stay. And I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you ask me to." Her eyes welled up, but she smiled. "Then maybe we should start planting tomatoes." We did the very next weekend. The soil was hard at first, resistant, but we kept at it. And by the time we'd finished, our hands were dirty, our backs sore, and our hearts somehow lighter. It wasn't about the tomatoes. It was about choosing to invest in something with time, about planting something we wouldn't see the fruit of 4 months, believing it would come. The garden slowly became our shared metaphor for everything that was unfolding between us. Every time we knelt in the dirt to tend the tiny sprouts, I was reminded that growth took patience, attention, and the willingness to get your hands dirty. Nora approached it the same way she approached most things, quietly observant, intentional, with a touch of stubbornness. She would tilt her head to the side, studying the tiny green leaves like they were trying to tell her something, and then water them just enough, never too much. "They don't need rescuing," she once said, watching a tomato plant that had slumped over after a windy night. "We just need time to stand back up." And maybe she was talking about more than the plants. Maybe she was talking about herself. We fell into that warm phase of knowing someone deeply, where routines become rituals, and rituals begin to anchor the days. I'd wake up early, sometimes before her, and leave a note on the counter if I went for a run. Of coffee in the truck when she knew I had a long day ahead. There were no declarations, no questions about what are we or where is this going. The answer was always in the way we showed up for each other. It was in how she'd gently untangle my scarf when I came in from the cold, or how I learned to recognize the look she got when her anxiety began to creep in from the edges. One evening, I came home from a job to find the house unusually quiet. Nora wasn't in the kitchen, not in the garden, not curled up on the porch reading like she often did around that hour. I called out, and after a beat she answered faintly from upstairs. I climbed the stairs to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, holding a small stack of medical papers in her lap. She looked up at me, eyes wide, and simply said, "Can we talk?" I nodded and sat beside her, not pressing, just waiting. She handed me the papers. "I went in for a routine checkup last week. They ran some tests. I wasn't expecting anything. I just figured it was time to get things looked at." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I scanned the documents. The words weren't dire, not yet, but they weren't benign either. A follow-up was needed. A specialist. The kind of language that makes your breath catch for a second before reason sets in. "It's probably nothing," she said, trying to smile. "I didn't want to keep it from you." I wrapped my arm around her, pulled her close, and kissed the side of her head. "Whatever it is, we'll face it. Together." She didn't respond right away, but I felt her body relax into mine, the tension releasing like steam. Later that night, after dinner and a quiet walk under the stars, she looked at me and said, "You didn't even flinch. Most people run at the first sign of risk." I met her gaze and said, "I'm not most people, and you're not a risk. You're a choice I make every day." The next few weeks were filled with hospital visits and test results. I drove her to every appointment, sat in every waiting room, and held her hand when she needed it. The uncertainty was the hardest part, the waiting. There's a particular kind of anxiety that creeps in when you're stuck between knowing and not knowing, between fearing the worst and hoping for the best. But we managed. Managed because we had each other. During one of those long afternoons in the hospital waiting area, Nora turned to me and said something I wasn't expecting. "If this turns out to be something serious, I need you to promise me something." I raised an eyebrow. "Promise you'll still live your life. Don't let it get stuck around me. Keep working." Keep fixing things. Keep building whatever it is. As you've been building, even if I can't always be there. I took a breath, then shook my head. That's not how this works. You're not a detour. You're part of the road. I won't keep driving if you're not riding with me. She cried then, and I held her until the nurse called her name. The results came back the following week. The news wasn't tragic, but it wasn't insignificant either. The mass they'd found was benign, but needed to be removed. Surgery was scheduled. Recovery would take weeks, maybe months. She tried to brush it off as a minor thing, but I knew it scared her. Not just the procedure, but the vulnerability it required. Nora wasn't used to letting people care for her. She had always been the strong one, the one who managed, who endured, who held herself together with spit and stubbornness. But now she had to let go, and she did, piece by piece. She let me help her in and out of bed. Let me wash her hair when her arms were too sore to lift. Let me read to her when the pain meds made the words on the page blur. She let me be there fully. And that kind of trust, it's a form of love more powerful than any grand gesture. It's love in its most vulnerable, most human form. During her recovery, we talked more than ever. She told me about her childhood, about her father's long silences, and her mother's brittle kindness. She told me how she used to pretend her stuffed animals were her real family, how she'd write stories about running away to a lighthouse where the ocean was always calm and the air always smelled like lavender. I told her about the night I almost gave up my handyman business and took an office job just to feel stable. I'm glad you didn't, she said, her hand resting on my knee. You fix more than sinks and fences. You fix spaces. You fixed this space. She was strong enough. We sat back in the garden, watching the tomatoes grow tall, little green bulbs beginning to swell with promise. She reached over, took my hand, and said, I never thought I'd be loved like this. I didn't think it was possible after 40. But here we are, and I'm 45, and I'm still here. And you stayed. I looked at her, eyes shining in the golden hour light, and replied, Of course I did. I never saw your age. I saw your soul. Summer slid gently into fall, the light shifting into something softer, and the days beginning to stretch a little thinner as evenings cooled. The tomatoes ripened slowly, some splitting from the rain, others shining ruby red under the morning sun. Nora, now stronger after her surgery, had taken to sitting in the garden again, her notebook often balanced on her lap, a steaming mug within arm's reach. I'd catch her out there just watching the breeze stir the leaves, her fingers absently, twirling the pen she rarely put down anymore. She was writing, again really writing, not just notes or half-thoughts, but scenes, dialogue, chapters. The characters she created reflected something of her, weathered but resilient, complicated but brave. When she read them to me at night, sometimes shy, sometimes proud, I couldn't help but smile. There was a new fire in her, something unspoken, that had finally stirred after years buried beneath silence and fear. I kept working, still taking jobs here and there, but I didn't roam far anymore. People began to notice. Clients would ask if I was slowing down or retiring. I'd just shrugged and say I had something worth coming home to. The truth was, I didn't want to be away for long. I'd spent most of my life floating from place to place, staying just long enough to fix what was broken, and then moving on before I could be asked to stay. But with Nora, it wasn't about fixing anymore. It was about building. We weren't rushing anything. There were no promises made in the dark, no talks of marriage or big moves, but there was a steadiness, a groundedness. It's like we'd finally found the pace we were always meant to walk at. One crisp October morning, we were raking leaves in the front yard when she paused mid-rake and looked over at me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever feel like the world expects you to stop dreaming after a certain age? I stopped, leaning on the rake. All the time. That's just noise. I think the real magic is in daring to dream even when they say it's too late. She smiled, dropping her rake. Then maybe we should try dreaming a little louder. And she told me about a writing residency program she had found, one tucked away in a coastal town 2 states over. It wasn't prestigious or fancy, but it would give her space and time to focus on her novel. The catch? It was 3 months long. She was hesitant to apply, not wanting to disrupt what we had. What if it changes things? She asked that night. What if distance ruins what we've built? I took a long breath and then told her the truth. What we have isn't fragile, Nora. It's not made of glass. It's made of time, of truth, of quiet mornings and hard days. Go. Take the chance I'll be here when you come back. And she applied. A few weeks later, she was accepted. The day she left, I drove her to the train station. She packed light, just 2 suitcases, her notebook, and a framed photo of the garden, now fading into its autumn rest. We didn't cry, though the air between us was thick with emotion. She kissed me once, then again, and whispered, "Don't forget to water the lavender." I promised I would, and then watched the train pull away. Her figure slowly swallowed by distance and steel and time. The house was quieter without her, but not hollow. It held her in the smell of her perfume still lingering on the sheets, in the half-used candle on the windowsill, in the unfinished manuscript she'd left open on her desk. I kept the routines going. I watered the plants, fed the neighbors. Kat, who liked to visit our porch, fixed the creaking steps in the back. But I also wrote to her. Every few days I'd send her letters, not emails, real ones, handwritten. I told her about the garden, about how the tomatoes had finally given up the ghost, about how the first frost came early this year. I described the quiet mornings, the way the mist hung low in the trees. I didn't ask her to write back. I just wanted her to know I was still here, still grounded. She called when she could, her voice bright and alive. She told me about the other writers at the residency, about the meals they shared, the long walks she took along the cliffs. She told me her novel was coming along slowly, but surely. It's about a woman who runs away from everything she knows, she said one night, and finds herself building something unexpected in the quiet. I smiled at the parallel, but didn't mention it. Time passed. The leaves fell, snow came and went, and before I knew it, 3 months had passed. She came back on a cold February morning. I stood waiting at the station, nervous for no reason at all. Would it be different now? Would the distance have changed us? But when she stepped off the train, hair tucked beneath a wool hat, eyes lit up like embers, I knew nothing important had changed. She dropped her bags, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "I missed you." In that moment, the months apart collapsed into something simple and unbreakable. Back home, she unpacked slowly, deliberately. She had brought back gifts, a scarf from the little town's market, a book signed by one of her favorite authors, and a worn notebook filled cover to cover. "I finished it," she said, placing it in my hands. "The novel. It's all there." I didn't open it yet, just held it like it was something sacred. That night, we sat on the porch again, 2 mugs of hot cider in our hands, watching the stars above the frosty lawn. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "You stayed." I kissed the top of her head and said, "You asked if I would," and I said yes. I meant it then. I mean it now, and I'll keep meaning it. Spring arrived without ceremony, as if the earth had quietly decided it was time to begin again. The snow melted into the soil. The lavender began peeking through with shy green shoots. The cherry blossoms in the park near the town center painted the sidewalks with soft pink petals. Life settled back into its rhythm with Nora home again, though something about it now felt more rooted, more permanent. Her time away hadn't put distance between us. It had clarified the closeness. It was no longer a question of whether we belonged in each other's lives. That had already been answered. Now, we were simply learning how to hold that truth with grace. She began sending her manuscript to publishers, carefully, cautiously, like someone releasing a fragile bird into the wind. Some replies came back, quickly formed letters, polite rejections. Others never came at all. But one day, while I was in the backyard repairing a loose fence post, she came rushing out barefoot, waving a piece of paper like a victory flag. "They want it," she shouted, breathless. "A small house, but they love the story. They want to publish it." I dropped the hammer, ran to her, and caught her as she leapt into my arms. That night we celebrated with takeout and cheap wine. Sitting on a blanket in the living room like teenagers, laughing until our sides hurt, it wasn't just her victory. It felt like ours. Every late night, every quiet morning, every whispered encouragement, and every choice to stay had led us here. But even joy cast shadows. About a month later, as Nora's publishing process began to unfold and meetings and emails started filling her calendar, something shifted in the air between us. It wasn't dramatic. No arguments, no accusations, just a subtle change in how we moved through the same space. She started waking up earlier than me, already lost in edits before I made coffee. I'd get home from jobs and find her on the phone, her voice clipped professional. She was focus-driven in a way I had never seen before. And while I was proud of her, I couldn't help but feel like I was starting to orbit her world instead of being inside it. One evening, I found her standing in the hallway staring at the wall we had painted together months ago. She didn't notice me at first. Her fingers were tracing the uneven edge where the paint had bled slightly under the tape. When she finally turned to me, her face was unreadable. "What happens if this takes off?" she asked softly. "They want me to tour? To speak? To relocate?" I stepped closer. "Then we talk about it. We figure it out. Together." She looked away. "I've never had to carry someone else's needs with mine before. I don't want to hold you back, or be held back." That stung, though I tried not to show it. "Are you saying I'm in the way?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "No, never. I'm saying I don't know how to do both yet. I'm scared of messing this up. Of resenting the thing I've always wanted because I'm trying to juggle it with something else I didn't expect." We didn't say much more. That night, we brushed our teeth in silence and crawled into bed facing opposite walls. The distance in that bed felt colder than any winter I'd ever known. Over the next few days, we tried to pretend nothing had changed, but it had. We still moved through our days side by side, but something between us had grown fragile. I kept asking myself whether this was the part where things naturally unraveled, where people returned to their own separate paths after walking together for a season. Or was this just a necessary bend in the road, one we had to round together? One Saturday morning, I decided to leave early and clear my head. I drove out to a nearby lake, the kind we used to visit on slow weekends, and sat on the dock watching the water shimmer under the early sun. I thought about my life before her quiet. Simple, untethered. I remembered how I used to pride myself on not needing anyone, on never staying in one place long enough to build attachments. And then I thought about Nora, about how easily she had undone all of that with her quiet strength and her unspoken belief that love could be both fierce and gentle. That afternoon, I returned home and found her in the garden. She was kneeling beside the lavender, dirt on her knees, sleeves rolled up. She looked up when she heard me, and her face softened. "I thought you left," she said, not accusing, just honest. I crouched beside her. "I thought about it," I admitted, "but leaving's easy. I've done it my whole life. Staying? That's harder. That's where the truth lives." Look down at the small purple blooms. "I've been pushing you away. Not because I don't want this, but because I want it too much. It terrifies me. Every time something good has come into my life, it's slipped away." I guess I started bracing for the fall. I reached out, took her soil-streaked hand. "In mine, we're not falling, Nora. We're learning how to hold steady." She nodded slowly. "And let's stop pretending. Let's talk about what this is. What we're building. What we want it to be." So we did. We talked late into the night about fear, about ambition, about compromise, about love. Not the kind that burns bright and dies out, but the kind that stays lit, even in the quiet, dim corners. We talked about living together full-time, about merging our rhythms more intentionally. She shared her dreams for her book. I shared my fears of being left behind. And in the middle of it all, we promised nothing but this: to keep choosing each other. Day by day, in every messy, beautiful version of the future. By the end of that week, I had moved the last of my things into the house knot with a box and a dramatic announcement. But one drawer at a time, one quiet shift after another, It felt natural, inevitable. The life we were weaving wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was enough. Life had started to feel settled again, the way a tree settles into soil after being transplanted cautiously, then completely. Nora and I fell into a rhythm that was neither rushed nor stagnant. We navigated our days, with a quiet kind of intimacy, shared coffee in the mornings, overlapping work sessions in the afternoons, long walks through the neighborhood in the evenings. Her manuscript was now moving into the final stages of production, and she had begun. Working on her second novel, her mind alive with new characters and conflicts. I took on fewer jobs, just enough to keep my hands busy and my head clear. The house no longer felt like hers or mine. It felt like ours. Our photos lined the hallway, our books shared shelves. Our laughter filled the quiet. Then, without warning, the past came knocking. It was a Friday, early evening. I had just returned from repairing a porch railing across town when I saw Nora standing frozen in the living room, her phone in one hand, the other clutched tightly to her chest. Her face had gone pale, lips parted as if trying to form words but coming up empty. I dropped my tool bag immediately and rushed to her side. She handed me the phone without speaking. A text was still glowing on the screen. Just 5 words. "In town? Can we talk?" It was from her ex-husband. I had known about him, of course. She told me bits and pieces during our long talks in the early months, how the marriage had crumbled under the weight of neglect and emotional distance. How he had walked away without so much as a real goodbye. She hadn't seen or heard from him in over 5 years. In her mind, he had become something like a ghost reel once, but no longer part of her world. Now he was back. Nora didn't say much that night. She paced, chewed her nails, stared out the window as if she expected him to appear on the porch. I didn't press. I gave her space, made tea, left her alone when she needed it. Later, as we lay in bed, she finally spoke. "I don't know why he's here. I don't know what he wants. But I need to see him. Not because I have unfinished feelings, but because I need to close a door that I never got to lock." I nodded, then see him. "That's what you need to move forward? Do it. I'll be here when you get back." She touched my hand, her grip gentle but firm. "Thank you for trusting me." The next afternoon, she met him at a cafe downtown. I stayed home, pretending to read, pretending not to check the clock every 10 minutes. Hours passed. The sun sank low. Finally, the front door opened. She stepped inside slowly, her expression unreadable. I stood, bracing myself. "He wanted to apologize," she said, setting her coat down. "He's remarried now, has a daughter. He said he needed to see me to say the things he couldn't say back then." I stayed quiet, letting her take her time. "He asked me if I ever hated him," she continued. "I told him no. I told him I mourned the version of us that could have been, but I don't hate him. Not anymore." She looked up at me then, eyes glassy but clear, and then he asked if I was happy. I said yes, and I meant it. I closed the distance between us and pulled her into a hug. Her body sagged against mine with relief. "It's over now," she whispered. "Really over." That night, she slept more deeply than she had in weeks. But the past doesn't always leave quietly. A week later, Nora received a package. No return address. Inside was a small box, and tucked within it, a bundle of old letters. Letters she had. Written years ago, during the final days of her marriage, but never sent. She recognized her handwriting instantly.
Somehow.
He had kept them. And now, inexplicably, he had returned them.
Oh.
She read each one in silence. Some were full of grief, others of hope, many of anger. But they were all versions of her that she had long since outgrown. Still reading them reopened something. Grew quiet in the days that followed, not distant, but pensive, like she was sitting across a table from her former self, trying to make peace. One evening, I found her in the attic, sitting among dusty boxes. She was holding a small photo of herself from years ago, back when she was still married. She turned it toward me. "Do you think we ever really change, or do we just learn to carry ourselves differently?" I sat beside her. "Maybe both. Maybe change isn't about becoming someone else. Maybe it's about finally becoming who we were meant to be. She nodded slowly. I just keep wondering if the version of me you love is real, or if she's still figuring herself out. Reached for her hand. The version of you I love is the one who keeps showing up, even when she's unsure. The one who asks the hard questions and doesn't run from the answers. You don't have to be finished growing to be loved. That night we talked for hours. She told me things she hadn't before about the loneliness of her marriage, about the quiet shame she carried for staying as long as she did, about the ways she had lost herself trying to become someone else's ideal. I listened, not to fix, but to understand. And when she finally laid her head on my chest, I felt the last wall between us crumble. The next morning, Nora took the bundle of letters, wrapped them in twine, and placed them in the fireplace. Together, we watched them burn. Not out of spite, but as a release, symbolic letting go of every version of herself that had been defined by someone else. When the flames died down, she turned to me and said, "That's the last time I let the past decide how I see myself." From that day forward, something in her shifted. She stood straighter, laughed more freely, created more boldly. Her second book took shape quickly, this time a story about a woman rebuilding her life, not from scratch, but from truth. And I, for my part, fell in love with her all over again, not because she had overcome something, but because she had allowed herself to feel it all without flinching. The days grew longer as spring reached its full bloom. And with it came a quiet transformation in our lives, not the kind that announces itself loudly or demands attention, but the kind that takes root beneath the surface, steady and sure. Nora's writing corner by the living room window became a permanent fixture littered with drafts and notes and half-drunk mugs of tea. I had installed new shelves there for her books, and on Sunday mornings, we'd sit side by side on the couch reading our own separate novels, occasionally exchanging thoughts or soft glances. There was a comfort to the silence between us now, the kind of ease that only grows when two people have walked through enough shadows to understand the light they found. We had stopped marking time by major events and instead measured it in smaller ways. Like how the ivy we planted last year had finally started to climb the garden wall, or how we'd begun cooking more elaborate meals together on weekends. Nora would try new recipes with messy abandon, laughing at her own missteps while I played the role of sous chef, chopping vegetables or fetching ingredients as requested. Our conversations had taken on a new rhythm too, less guarded, more layered. We'd started talking about what our future could look like, not just in vague terms, but in real, tangible ways. It was during one of those quiet evenings, while we sat outside beneath a sky full of stars, that Nora asked a question that would linger between us for days. Do you ever think about what it would mean to grow old together? Not just stay in love, but age side by side. Watch our bodies change, our routines shift, our friends move on. I looked at her, her face gently lit by the moonlight, and for a moment I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know how I felt, but because I knew how much that question meant coming from her. She had lived through abandonment, through starting over at an age when many people settle into their patterns and stop believing in new beginnings. Yes, I said finally. I think about it all the time, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet hope. After that night, we began to talk about what permanence really meant for us. Neither of us were in a rush to put labels on our relationship. We weren't the type to chase traditional milestones for the sake of checking boxes. But still, the idea of home, of a shared space that belonged to both of us fully, had started to feel more necessary. My name was not yet on the house deed. I had moved in gradually, my belongings blending into hers, but technically, it was still hers alone. One afternoon, while I was in the garage sorting through old tools, Nora came out holding a folder. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice even but intentional. "I want to put your name on the deed. Not just because you live here, but because this place, it's ours, has been for a while now." I looked at her, heart suddenly full. "You sure?" She nodded, more than sure. We went through the legal steps a week later. It was a simple process on paper, but what it symbolized between us was anything but simple. It was a declaration of trust, of commitment beyond words, felt bigger than a ring or a ceremony. It was a merging of lives that went beyond romance and into real adult partnership. The kind built not on fantasy, but on choice after choice after choice. A few weeks later, Nora received the official cover art for her first novel. The publisher had done a beautiful job, a soft watercolor illustration of a woman walking down a long road, surrounded by open sky. She cried when she saw it, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A dream brought to life. We framed the cover and hung it near her desk. The launch date was set for late summer, and a small book tour was planned in nearby cities. This time, she didn't question whether she should go. She asked if I would come with her, so we planned it out. I took on fewer contracts. She arranged the tour so we could drive instead of fly. It became a kind of extended road trip readings in small bookstores, late-night conversations in unfamiliar hotel rooms, shared breakfasts in quiet diners. I watched her shine in ways I hadn't seen before, confident, eloquent, radiant in front of readers who resonated with her words. I sat in the back of those events, heart swelling, not out of pride for her success, but for who she had become through it all. One evening, in a city 2 hours from home, we stayed at a bed and breakfast, nestled beside a lake. After her reading, we walked down to the water, hand in hand, our fingers entwined like roots of the same tree. The air was warm, the moon reflected on the water in rippling silver. Nora stopped, turned to me and said, "I know we've taken our time. I know. We've both needed space to become who we are, but I don't want to keep dancing around it." I knew what she was about to say, but I didn't interrupt. "Do you want to make this official? I'm not asking for a wedding or anything fancy. Just a day that's ours, something that says we choose this life together." I didn't hesitate. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes. We didn't call it an engagement. Didn't set a date. We didn't tell anyone for weeks. But something shifted between us that night, like two rivers finally merging into one. We began planning not just a life together, but a legacy. Conversations turned to what kind of home we wanted in 5 years, how we might support other artists, where we'd travel once her second book was done. We even started talking about adopting a rescue dog, something we both had quietly longed for but hadn't voiced yet. It wasn't about creating a future that looked good on paper. It was about designing a life that felt like home. Later that month, back in our town, we hosted a small dinner for friends and neighbors. It was our quiet way of celebrating. Nora made her famous roasted squash soup. I grilled vegetables on the porch, our home filled with laughter and music, and when someone asked how we met, we smiled at each other. He was fixing my bathroom. "Sink," Nora said, the room erupting in gentle laughter. And I asked him a question that changed everything. We never stopped fixing things, leaky pipes, cracked walls, broken stories. But we had also started building, not from scratch, but from what was real. And in every corner of our shared life, that truth echoed back to us. Not everything broken needs replacing. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to stay. The house had never felt more alive. With the windows cracked open to let in the early summer breeze and the scent of lavender wafting through the rooms, it was as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe with us. There was a stillness in our days, now not the kind born from boredom or complacency, but the kind that settles when two people have finally stopped bracing for the floor to fall out beneath them. Nora and I moved through the space as one, without needing to speak, without trying to impress. Her book was set to launch in just under a month, and there was a quiet anticipation hanging in the air. Like the hush before a storm, but a storm we were ready for. She had been up late most nights, curled on the couch editing her second manuscript, which had become something of a love letter to transformation. I would sit nearby, sometimes sketching designs for a new client's deck, or just listening to music, occasionally glancing over at her in awe. Not because she looked perfect in those moments, hair a mess, glasses sliding down her nose, but because there was something incredibly beautiful about watching someone fully engaged in their purpose. We didn't need to fill the silence with chatter. The comfort came in the knowing that she was there. So was I. Both of us leaning into this life we had built brick by brick. One Saturday morning, Nora asked me if I wanted to help her clean out the attic. It had been one of those Toto items that had lingered for over a year, always postponed in favor of more exciting plans. I agreed, thinking we'd spend a few hours dusting off boxes and tossing old college notebooks. But what unfolded was something more layered. As we climbed the creaky stairs and stepped into the warm, dust-scented space, we were met with a time capsule of her life before me. Photos in mismatched frames, boxes labeled in thick marker, forgotten trinkets from years that seemed too far away to belong to her now. We sorted through the boxes slowly. Nora held up a faded picture of herself at 27, standing on a beach with her arms wrapped around someone I recognized only from a single story she once told. "That was during the year I thought I had it all figured out," she murmured with a soft, self-aware smile. I was wrong, of course. But that version of me really believed it. I didn't respond with a joke or reassurance. I simply sat beside her and listened as she unpacked pieces of her past, not with regret, but with tenderness. It was as if she was finally giving herself permission to acknowledge where she'd been without allowing it to define where she was going, toward the back of the attic. I found a box I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I saw a stack of papers drawings. Not professional, not polished, but deeply personal. Nora laughed when she saw them. "I used to sketch," she said, eyes wide with nostalgia. Before life got busy, and I decided I wasn't good enough to keep going, I handed one to her. Maybe it's not about being good. Maybe it's just about creating because it makes you feel something. She looked at me, then down at the sketch, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, a mixture of wonder and sadness. "You always do that?" she said quietly. "Remind me that the parts of me I've hidden are still worth seeing later." That evening, as we sat on the porch with a glass of wine between us, she turned to me with that same look of quiet resolve I'd come to know. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked. "Not perfect, but safe, honest, choosing each other over and over?" I thought for a long moment. "I think we will," I said, "because we're not building a love that depends on staying the same. We're building one that grows with us, that shifts and bends but doesn't break." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I want to write that down one day, in a story, so other people remember that love doesn't have to burn out to be real. It can be slow, quiet, enduring." I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "Write it. I'll read every word." In the days that followed, a sense of clarity settled between us. We didn't need big declarations or grand gestures. The life we had was enough, but we still found ways to celebrate it, to honor it. On the eve of her book launch, Nora surprised me. She had transformed the backyard into a small garden party, with lights strung between the trees and photos from our time together, clipped along a line like laundry drying in the sun. Close friends came. Our neighbors showed up with dishes in hand, and as the evening wore on, Nora gave a short, impromptu speech. She thanked everyone for believing in her, then paused, searching for me in the crowd. "There's someone I didn't thank yet," she said. "Roman. The man who came to fix my bathroom sink and somehow fixed something in me I didn't even realize was broken. He didn't ask me to change, didn't save me. He stayed, and that made all the difference." The crowd clapped, some with tears in their eyes, but I didn't hear any of it. I was too focused on Huron, the woman who had once stood in her doorway, unsure if she was too late to find something real. Now here she was, radiant in the golden hour light, surrounded by people who loved her, telling the story of us not as a fantasy, but as a truth we had earned. As the night came to a close, and the guests began to trickle out, Nora and I stood together under the stars. "Do you think this is the end of our story?" she asked, half joking. I shook my head. "No, this is just the end of the first chapter." She smiled, took my hand, and we walked inside. The weeks after Nora's book launch settled into a new kind of normal, one colored by quiet pride and a deepening awareness of how far we had come. Her face appeared on a local magazine cover. Friends started tagging her in social media posts where readers quoted her lines, back paragraphs underlined and hearts scribbled in the margins. She handled the attention with humility, laughing at her awkwardness during interviews and shooing away compliments with a wave of her hand. But in private, I saw how much it moved her, how deeply the recognition stitched itself into old wounds that once whispered she wasn't good enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't young enough to begin again. And each time, I saw her eyes soften. When someone said her story helped them feel less alone, I knew she wasn't just becoming an author. She was becoming someone who had finally allowed herself to be seen. In our home, the changes were subtle but constant. We rearranged furniture, not for style, but for function, more room for her growing collection of books. More light for the plants that seemed to multiply with every trip to the nursery. We fixed the leaky back gate, installed a bench near it. The front porch, the kind you could sit on while sipping coffee and watching the neighbors walk by with their dogs. I found joy in those little tasks. Fixing things in our space had always been how I expressed care, and now it felt like maintenance, not just of a house, but of a life we were actively choosing. One afternoon, Nora came home with a surprise. She had adopted a dog from the shelter, a small, scruffy terrier mixed with wide eyes and a tail that never seemed to stop wagging. "Name is Otis," she announced, dropping the leash gently and kneeling beside the little furball. He was the oldest one in the shelter, they said. He'd been there for months. Couldn't leave him. I bent down, letting Otis sniff my hand before giving him a gentle pat. "Welcome home, buddy," I said. He licked my fingers and then darted into the living room as if he'd always belonged. That night, Otis curled up on the foot of our bed, snoring softly while we lay side by side, laughing about how we had unintentionally become a little family. Despite all this peace, a quiet question began to hum beneath the surface of our days. What's next? We never asked it directly, but it lingered in the way Nora began eyeing up new writing retreats, and I started turning down jobs that didn't feel right anymore. I found myself sketching blueprints for projects that didn't yet exist: tiny homes, creative studios, mobile libraries. Not because I was restless, but because something inside me had awakened again. Being with Nora hadn't dulled my ambition, had redirected it. I didn't just want to build things for clients anymore. I wanted to build something with purpose, something that could hold stories the way Nora's words did. One evening, as we sat watching the sun dip behind the trees, I finally said what had been on my mind for weeks. What if we took a trip? Not just for a weekend, but something longer. A few weeks. No plans, just us on the road. Nora looked at me, her brow raised in amusement. "Are you suggesting we become nomads?" I grinned. "Maybe. Temporarily. I think there's something out there we're supposed to find. Or maybe something we need to leave behind before we start the next phase." She thought about it for a long time. "Where would we go?" I shrugged. "Wherever the map takes us." That conversation sparked something. Over the next week, we planned a route starting north through the mountains, then west toward the coast. We arranged house sitting for a neighbor who agreed to care for Otis during our absence. We packed minimally: notebooks, cameras, coffee supplies, and enough clothes for changing weather. Yes. As we loaded up the car, I glanced back at our house and felt a pang not of fear, but of reverence. We were leaving, but we weren't escaping. We were expanding. The road trip began on a cool morning, the sky still gray with sleep. We drove in silence for the first hour, the hum of the engine and the occasional song on the radio filling the space. I reached over and took Nora's hand. She smiled without looking at me, squeezing once before returning her gaze to the road ahead. That small gesture said more than words ever could. In the first few towns we visited, we stayed in quirky motels and explored local bookshops. Nora read excerpts from her favorite authors under oak trees, while I sketched park benches, church towers, old mailboxes. In one coastal village, we met an elderly couple who had been married for over 50 years. They invited us to their porch for lemonade and told us stories of the life they'd built when filled with travel, setbacks, joy, and the quiet work of choosing each other every day. Nora and I sat there listening, our hands interlocked beneath the table. On the drive back to our inn, she whispered, "I hope we grow into that." We took photos everywhere we went, not for social media, but for memory. I captured Nora mid-laugh in front of a sunflower field. She snapped a picture of me asleep in a hammock, hat tilted over my face, notebook on my chest. We didn't document the perfect moments. We documented the honest ones, the tired ones, the quiet ones, the ones that might seem ordinary to others, but meant everything to us, somewhere along the third week. In a small cabin nestled between forest and lake, we sat under the stars with a bottle of red wine and no electricity, just candlelight. Nora pulled a small notebook from her bag and handed it to me. I started writing about us, she said softly. Not for publishing, just for me, for us. I want to remember how we got here. I opened it and saw pages filled with her handwritings, some neat, others scribbled in haste. Each entry a snapshot of our journey, from the bathroom sink to the mountain peaks. I felt tears prick my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the weight of love that had grown so quietly, steadily, that I sometimes forgot how profound it truly was. I closed the notebook, reached across the table, and touched her cheek. "Thank you," I said, "for seeing me, for staying." She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. "I didn't stay," she whispered. "I chose, and I'll keep choosing." The candles flickered. The night deepened. And somewhere in the stillness we knew, whatever came next, be it years or days, or just another morning with coffee and Otis's tail thumping against the floor weave, we're ready. Because the road hadn't just taken us somewhere new. It had returned us to each other. The return home was quiet, gentle, almost like stepping into a memory that had patiently waited for us to come back. As we pulled into the driveway, Otis barked from the front window, tail wagging wildly even before we had opened the car doors. Nora laughed, the sound high and breathless, like a note carried by the wind, and in that moment it struck me just how much life had unfolded in the spaces between where we began and where we now stood. The house looked the same, but we were not. Our footsteps echoed differently now, more assured, more intertwined. The kitchen still smelled like rosemary and lemon. The books still leaned in cozy rows along the living room shelves. But the air felt fuller, as if the house itself had inhaled everything we had learned out there and held it within its walls. We unpacked slowly, neither of us in a rush to push away the rhythm of the road. Nora set our travel journal on the coffee table, next to the candle we'd brought back from that tiny seaside market in Mendocino. I took a beat longer than usual, setting my tool belt back on its hook, running my fingers across the leather like it was something sacred. That belt had been the beginning of all this. A cracked sink and a busted pipe that turned into one of the most unexpected, transformative loves of my life. Our days fell back into routine, though nothing about it felt mundane. Otis followed us from room to room, never quite satisfied unless we were both in view. Nora returned to writing, this time with less urgency and more grace, and I found myself taking on fewer clients, picking only the projects that truly spoke to me. We talked more about building a space in the backyard, something Nora could use for writing retreats, and something I could turn into a small workshop. The idea wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it felt right. A shared dream that gave both of us the room to grow while staying rooted in the same soil. One night, as we sat out back beneath the string lights I had installed last fall, Nora turned to me with that familiar curiosity in her eyes. "Do you ever think about marriage?" She asked, not in a way that demanded an answer, but in the tone she used when exploring an idea, gently and without pressure. I took a deep breath, not out of hesitation but reverence. "I think about it sometimes," I said. In that traditional sense. But in the way you plant a tree, knowing you won't see its full height. Promise not for perfection, but for presence. She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I don't need a dress or a big day. But maybe one morning, we'll wake up, look at each other, and just decide if it feels like the day." That was Nora. Unbound by convention, but deeply tied to meaning. And that's when I realized we had already made that vow in 1,000 quiet ways. In every morning coffee, every bookshelf built, every hand held across the center console of a moving car. The following week, Nora's publisher reached out with news. Her book had been shortlisted for an award. She read the email twice before turning to me with wide, disbelieving eyes. "I don't even care if I win," she whispered. "Just being seen like this, it's surreal." I wrapped her in my arms and kissed her forehead. It's not odd, surreal. It's deserved. And I meant every word. She had carved a place in the world using nothing but her truth. And now the world was beginning to echo it back. With the recognition came invitations, panels, interviews, even a podcast series. At first, she hesitated. She liked being home, being grounded. But I reminded her that just as we had taken that trip to stretch our boundaries, maybe these invitations were the next part of her becoming. So she said yes, carefully, selectively, always with the promise that home would be her anchor. And I promised the same, that no matter where her voice carried her, I'd be there, not just in the audience, but behind every word, every breath, every leap. Meanwhile, I took on a special project, restoring a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town. It belonged to an elderly woman who had lived there her whole life and wanted it ready for her grandchildren to inherit. The work was slow, meditative. Each board I replaced, each nail I drove into softened wood, felt like therapy. Sometimes I'd bring Nora to see the progress. We'd sit on the half-finished porch watching the sun set over the hills. You bring life back to things, she once told me as we watched the amber light spill through the broken window. Frames, not just buildings, people too. Autumn arrived earlier than expected. Trees around our neighborhood turned shades of fire and honey, and we found ourselves gravitating toward the warmth of the indoors again. Nora's second book was well underway, more daring than the first, less polished but far more personal. She read me drafts in the evening, her voice catching on certain phrases. Sometimes because they were raw and real, and sometimes because they were beautiful. I didn't always understand every metaphor, but I understood her, and that was enough. One night, as we sat by the fire with Otis curled between us, Nora asked if I ever imagined what life might have looked like if we hadn't met. I thought about it, really tried to picture that version of my life, the one where I'd fixed a bathroom sink and then simply left, none the wiser to the woman who had been standing in her hallway holding years of stories behind her eyes. Shook my head. I don't think I'd want to know, 'cause that version of me, he wouldn't know what it's like to be truly seen. She didn't say anything, but her fingers tightened around mine. And in that silence, I felt everything. Gratitude, grace, and an unwavering belief that what we had was rare. It's not because it was easy or perfect, but because it was honest, built. From the small moments, fortified by choice. Later that week, as I was finishing up the porch at the cabin, the elderly woman came out with a mason jar of tea and sat beside me. She looked at me and smiled in that knowing way older folks do. "Oh, you've got someone, don't you?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I do." She sipped her tea, then said, "Then remember this. It's not about the big gestures. It's about the staying, the showing up. Every single day." I smiled, not just because she was right, but because Nora had once said nearly the same thing. Life has a funny way of circling back to remind us what matters. That night, I brought home a small frame. In it, I placed one of Nora's earliest sketches, the one she thought wasn't good enough to keep. I hung it beside our door where we'd pass it every morning and every evening. A quiet reminder that even imperfect beginnings can lead to extraordinary things. And as we stood there that night, arm in arm beneath the soft hum of our porch light, watching leaves drift down like whispers from the sky, I knew something deeper than certainty. I knew that whatever seasons came, whatever chapters followed, I would stay. Because she had asked once, in a moment of trembling vulnerability, if I would still stay at 45. And the truth I had come to learn was that I'd stay at 55, 65, 85, because staying wasn't the hard part, and it was the honor. Winter crept in softly that year, not with blizzards or ice storms, but with the kind of cold that made you want to stay inside a little longer. Light more candles, wrap yourself in old sweaters that smelled like memory. The trees outside stood, bare but proud, and Nora's breath fogged up the window as she sat with Otis curled at her feet, rereading the final pages of her new manuscript. She had titled it, "When It's Enough," a quiet declaration, a statement of her own arrival. When she finished reading, she placed the pages gently on the table and looked over at me. I was at the kitchen counter sanding down a small block of wood. For a project I wasn't in a hurry to finish. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The air between us was full and warm and easy, like a fire that no longer needed tending. Life didn't feel like a movie climax or a dramatic twist. There was no wedding dress hanging in the closet, no proposal under fairy lights. It was just this, waking up beside someone who didn't need to be fixed, who didn't want to fix me, who simply asked, every day, what do you need? And waited to hear the real answer. There was no pressure to perform, no roles to play. Nora didn't want me to be more than I was. She just wanted me to be here. And I wanted the same for her. We marked the anniversary of the day we met in the most unceremonious way possible, by fixing the same sink I had come for that first afternoon. It had developed a slight leak again, not enough to cause damage, but enough to remind us that things, even well-maintained, eventually need care. As I tightened the valve and wiped down the porcelain, Nora leaned in the doorway sipping her coffee, her hair piled in a messy bun, wearing the same faded hoodie she'd had for years. Still remember how you reacted when I asked you that? Question, she teased, eyes full of mischief. I smirked, standing up and tossing the wrench into the toolbox. You mean the would you still stay if I were 45 line? She nodded. Bold, wasn't it? It was honest, I replied. It was you. Later that evening, we took Otis for a walk through the park where the trees, now stripped of their leaves, looked like old souls whispering to one another. We didn't talk much. Sometimes love is quiet like that, not because there's nothing to say, but because your presence alone says enough. We passed a younger couple sitting on a bench, the woman laughing as the man playfully tossed snow in. Her lap, Nora squeezed my hand gently. Do you think we looked like that? I chuckled. No, we looked more like strangers figuring out how not to trip over each other. She laughed too, but we did figure it out. We're still figuring, I said, and that's the best part. That night, as we sat down to dinner, she slid a small envelope across the table to me. What's this? I asked. Something small, she replied. Inside was a printed reservation for a lakeside cabin 2 hours away. Just a weekend, she said, almost shyly. Thought we could disconnect, just us. No phones, no interviews, no clients. Just winter and maybe a fireplace if it works. I looked up at her and saw a woman who, once uncertain if love could still find her, was now planting roots not just in place, but in partnership. I'd love that, I said. I'd go anywhere with you. So we finished dinner and cleaned up. She playfully swatted my arm with a dish towel and told me I still loaded the dishwasher wrong. I argued that my way was more efficient. We bickered. Lightly, teasingly, like a dance we both knew, the steps to, by heart. And when the kitchen was quiet again, when the plates were stacked and Otis snored softly at our feet, we sat together in the dim light and simply breathed, because sometimes the most remarkable stories are the ones where nothing extraordinary happens except this. You meet someone who chooses to stay. Every day, every season, through the leaks, the long drives, the doubts, and the edits, through age, change, grief, and new beginnings. Through the ordinary moments that make up an extraordinary love, and as the snow began to fall softly outside our window, coating the world in a hush, I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, knowing without a doubt that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Spring arrived like a deep exhale after a long-held breath. The branches that had stood still and skeletal for months began to swell with soft green buds, and the light filtered differently through our windows warmer, more forgiving. It had been a full year since I first stepped into Nora's house. With my toolbox in hand, expecting nothing more than another quick fix, unaware I was walking into a story that would quietly change my life. We didn't celebrate the anniversary with champagne or balloons. Instead, we spent the day in the backyard, hands in the dirt, planting tomatoes and lavender, or potting old succulents, and laughing when Otis dug up what he must have thought was treasure. We marked time not by dates, but by the rhythms we'd grown into me, cooking on Wednesdays, her reading aloud on Sunday mornings, the way we met in the hallway each night without needing to say, "Come to bed." There were still hard days, of course there were. Mornings where I was too quiet, evenings where she stared too long at a blank page. Grief still crept in, unexpectedly hers, for the years she'd once thought she'd wasted, mine for the younger version of myself who thought real connection wasn't possible past a certain point. But the difference now was how we held each other through it, without trying to erase the sadness or fix the cracks. We let it exist. We let it soften us. One particularly rainy afternoon, we curled up on the couch with old photo albums. Nora had pulled them down from the top shelf, dusty and slightly bent. They were filled with pictures of her younger self, smiling through phases of life that now felt like Echo's college roommates. Old lovers, bad haircuts, better days. At one point, she paused on a photo of herself at 29, standing in front of a bookstore, bright-eyed and ambitious. Back then, she said, tracing the photo's edge with her thumb, I thought I needed to do everything before I turned 30, as if time was a door that would slam shut behind me. I leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You didn't miss the door, I said. You just chose the right one a little later. She smiled at that, not in gratitude, but in agreement, because by now, she had come to believe it too. Later that week, I finally finished building. The small studio out back, the space she'd been dreaming of for months. It had large windows that opened toward the garden, shelves already waiting for her books and notebooks, and a soft reading chair in the corner we'd picked out together. When she stepped inside for the first time, she didn't say anything. She just stood in the middle of the room, eyes glistening, before walking over and placing her palm flat against the wall. It feels like something new begins here, she whispered. And it did. We still hadn't married. We might never. But every day felt like a vow, the kind that didn't require witnesses or rings. A quiet promise etched into the details. Packed lunches, the evening walks, the shared silence that held more love than any speech could. I sometimes thought about how close we had come to never crossing paths, how a single missed appointment or a different phone call could have meant a life without Nora, and the weight of that possibility made every moment now feel all the more sacred. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hedges and the breeze carried the scent of lavender from the garden, Nora turned to me on the porch and said, You know, I've stopped asking if you'll stay. I looked at her, curious. Why's that? She took a sip of her tea and smiled gently, because staying is no longer the question. It's the answer. And just like that, the last piece of uncertainty slipped away, not in a rush, but in a whisper. I reached for her hand, and we sat there in the fading light, no longer wondering what came next. Because whatever came, we would meet it the same way we had met everything else together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.